In the previous lecture on immigration, I concluded by talking about the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Native American or Know Nothing Party. This will be the second lecture on immigration and continues with the late 19th century. In the late 19th century, people from Mexico were being recruited to work in the United States in mines, in the construction of railroads, and in agriculture. And in fact, this recruitment only intensified from the late 19th century until the end of the 1920s, where at first they would tell these workers, you know, next season, come back, or even bring a friend. To then these companies, by the turn of the century, they were sending recruiters to the US-Mexico border to hire people as soon as they crossed. Then by the 1910s and 20s, there were companies, employers in the United States that were sending recruiters into the interior of Mexico to recruit those workers. So it was a recruitment that only intensified from the 19th into the early 20th century. The late 19th century is also, well, the turn of the 19th century is also the height of Southern and Eastern European migration to the United States. So late 19th and early 20th. And we'll be touching on that. We'll be coming back to both these groups. First, I'll try to briefly bring up some of the background context. And that is, in the 1910s, there was a lot of union organizing, and the government was doing a lot of repression. The government would send in the National Guard to attack union organizers and protesters. The United States and police authorities would always side with employers. One of the biggest labor organizers in the 1910s was the IWW, the International Workers of the World, and people would refer to them as the Wobblies. But a lot of these workers were, how do I put this? So traditionally, unions only organized skilled labor and US citizens. The Wobblies were different in that they would organize any workers and, any workers that were kind of factory workers. And they also organized a lot of immigrants, especially Southern and Eastern Europeans that had just arrived, you know, in the previous decade or so, decade or 20 years. But with the United States, with World War I beginning in 1914 and the United States entering World War I in 1917, it is very common for nativism to grow during times of war, especially for people that are descendants, you know, who came from countries that were at war with. And so there was a lot of cracking down on the Wobblies and labor organizing in general. It got very intense, and they essentially got rid of practically all of union organizing. So then in the 1920s, there's a new period where instead of union organizing, big companies would have what they called welfare capitalism. And this was the idea that instead of having a union that is advocating for workers in an antagonistic way with the employer, instead the company was going to have its own union and they'd be, allies working together. But as you might imagine, these unions did not have any teeth, and they were always on the side of the employer, the factory owner, and so forth. And so, yeah, during these times, we have child labor. We don't have, the 40-hour work week. We don't have protections for people to not get injured at work. This is before Social Security benefits, before unemployment, before a lot of things. And this also even escalated into things like company towns and company script. Company towns is when, if you wanted to work for a factory, you had to live on their property. And so that meant that you never had a break from your employer, because they owned where you lived, they controlled how much you were making and how much you were spending on your rent. They had their own company stores where they dictated how much you were going to pay for, groceries or supplies. And then some of them even resorted to company script, which would be the modern day equivalent of getting paid with gift cards for the company you work for. And so, there were basically no limits to what employers could do in the control they had over people, short of slavery. The 1920s was also, well, from World War I and going into the 1920s, is also the height of nativism. This means it is the height of organizations like the KKK. It is the height of laws that target people for their nationality and race. The height of Jim Crow law, height of segregation. And so there's a lot of nativism in the 1920s. In the 1930s, well, 1929, we have the stock market crash. In the 1930s, we have the Great Depression, where the economy, goes to the ground. And then with the New Deal, we have the first time that the government is siding with workers and allowing them union rights and giving them protections like Social Security benefits and 40-hour work week, overtime pay, stuff like that. So that's my attempt to, as briefly as possible, provide some of the background to some of the things I'll be focusing on. More specifically, with regard to immigration, there were a number of laws that were passed during this time. There's the Immigration Act of 1917, Immigration Act of 1921, Immigration Act of 1924. Each one of these laws, it's like they would pass a law and then decide it wasn't strict enough. So then they would come up with another one. Then decide that one wasn't strict enough. So then come up with another one. And so it was this progression again of more intense nativism. And to show an example of that, these immigration acts were based on national origins. So they would target how many people could come from some part of the world based on what country they were coming from. And in particular, it was targeting the largest wave of immigrants that had come prior to the 1920s, and that was Southern and Eastern Europeans. So, for example, how it got more strict. In 1921, they said that 3% of the population that was already here in 1910 could come. So let's say we're talking about Italians. They would say, okay, what was the Italian population in 1910? Well, 3% of that can come in every year. But then 3 years later, 1924, they said, no, instead of 3%, let's make it 2%. And instead of making it 1910, when a lot of Italians were already here, Instead, let's pick 1890 before most of them came. And so it was an effort to tighten up, to be more strict, more restrictive, especially on Southern and Eastern Europeans. Immigration Act of 1924 also was the first to establish a border patrol. And for Latin America, it's important to note that there was no Western Hemisphere limit, meaning for Latin, these limitations did not apply to Latin America, those percentage limitations. With that said, it doesn't mean it didn't affect them. For example, and I'll be touching on this again more later, but I'll mention it now. In 1917, the Immigration Act of 1917 made it so that Mexicans had to be fumigated if they came in and say economy class train, then they would have to be fumigated, their bodies and their clothing and everything, in order to come to the United States. And so, yeah, imagine if you're traveling by plane right now, you know, today, and if you can't afford first class, then whenever you arrive to your destination and customs, they're going to make you get naked and be fumigated with chemicals that, in fact, and I'll be talking more about this later, the chemicals that were used to fumigate Mexican people were quoted by the Nazi Party in Germany with inspiring them on what chemicals to use for the gas chambers during World War II. And so we were being admired by Germany for our treatment of immigrants at that time. We'll come back to that. Examples of this nativism in the 1920s when the KKK was at its height. I show you this example of a picture of the chapter in the Eau Claire area. Lake Hallie is probably like, I don't know, like 5 miles north of here. And so I share this because it connects it locally, but also because it's a reminder that groups like this did not end with the end of slavery. B, it also wasn't just in the South. And it also wasn't just in big cities or distant places. I mean, in the 1920s, the KKK had members of Congress, mayors of cities, chiefs of police, editors of newspapers. They were everywhere. They were having big parades in downtowns of big cities. They were very prevalent. They were anti-Black, anti-Jew, and anti-Catholic. Here's another one. There was a women's chapter of the National KKK, 1924 to 1931, that they called themselves the Gray Eagles of Chippewa Falls. There's a book about this topic by a person from with the last name Kinville, in case anyone's curious to learn more about that. And that is an eligible research paper topic, by the way. Yeah. So I mentioned at the end of the lecture on the Mexican Revolution that following the Mexican Revolution in the 1920s, 10% of the Mexican population moved to the United States. The largest wave of Mexican immigration in Mexican or US history. And so, so then with the Great Depression came repatriation. Repatriation is when there were many people of Mexican descent that were pressured and encouraged to leave the US and go to Mexico. Now, we actually don't have concrete numbers on how many people this happened to, because this was not done as a national federal effort. This was done at local government levels. So a lot of county governments participated in this, especially in the Southwest, but nationwide. And so then we don't have accurate numbers of how many people. People who studied this and researched it and so forth say it could range from 500,000 to 2 million people. And the majority of the people who were pressured to leave were US born. And so, presumably came in the 1920s. They had children in the US. And then in the 1930s, they left with their children. And, so the majority were US born. Now, why do I say they were pressured? What is that about? You watched the film, My Family, where they show the mother, Maria, living in Los Angeles, going out to the store, and she gets rounded up and deported, even though she had been born in the US. So that did happen, but that was the minority of how people left. Basically, they did not have the resources to arrest and deport 2 million people. So what they would do is they would show up to say kind of border patrol immigration agents would show up to a place where there would be a lot of Mexican people, say downtown Los Angeles, Placita Olvera, and they would do a dragnet where they just surround the whole place and just close in and check everyone as they, kind of make their circle smaller. And then have the newspapers there documenting everything, so that all of this would be, journalists taking pictures, put it on the newspapers, and scare people into fearing that they're going to be arrested and deported that way. So that was one way. It was through the media, by scaring people. The other way, the more common way it happened, is during the Great Depression, when a lot of people lost their employment, and people of color in particular tended to be the last hired and first fired. People had to resort to, they called them relief. Relief is when people would go to a church once a month. It was kind of the 1930s version of today, what we would call welfare. They would, or kind of like food stamps in particular, because they would show up to this place once a month and they would be given some food that would help them make it to the next month. But county governments would pay for these people, would pay their railroad, their train ticket to go to Mexico. And so when they would show up for relief, they would be told, this is the last time you're getting relief. Next month, if you come back, all you can get is a train ticket to Mexico. And so that is how, people got unemployed, and then they, couldn't get any assistance. And the only assistance they could get was a train ride to Mexico. And so yeah, there was repatriation is kind of like self deportation, although it's, pressured. And so hence you have people here getting on the trains going back to Mexico. Now, the Mexican government actually worked side by side with the United States to get these people back. Why would the Mexican government do that? they were, how do I put it? So what the Mexican government would do is US county governments would pay for people's train ticket to Mexico. But then from the Mexican border, the Mexican government would pay to take them on a train from the US-Mexico border to whatever state they were originally from in whatever part of Mexico. And so the Mexican government cooperated with this. And again, why would they do this? A number of things. One of it, part of it is just kind of that's what governments try to do for their people. They try to look out for their people when they're abroad and help them get back. And but there's also the ulterior motive and it's Mexico's own biases. See, a lot of these people, even in Mexico, were seen as Native Americans or mixed race, mestizos, that come from rural parts of Mexico who do not have kind of like modern factory training. And so then they saw these as people that would help, that could help modernize Mexico because they had experience in US factories. They knew how to, arrive on time and clock in and, just stick to the schedule and just work in the way that modern factories worked. And so there's that incentive for Mexico from their perspective and self-interest as well. So one of the themes with regard to Mexican immigration and deportations and so forth is they're always going from wanted to unwanted. It's this back and forth. Late 19th century, early 20th century, we're recruiting them. Then the Great Depression hits and we're repatriating them. Then World War I starts and then we recruit them again. Then we see the growth of the undocumented population. And so in the 1950s, we deport them. And so it's this back and forth of recruiting them when we need their work and deporting them when we don't. So right now, I've only talked about the recruitment and repatriation. Later on, I'll talk about the Bracero Program and Operation Wetback. I won't go into those in detail yet. So yeah, I'll go into this. But I mention it briefly. Yeah, I'm not sure if I have these sources in my other PowerPoint, so I'll mention them briefly. So that you can get this in case you're curious to write about this in your research papers. So when they were recruited during World War II, it was the Bracero Program. And there's these two books by Erasmo Gamboa about this, Mexican Labor in World War II, focusing on the Northwest. And then there's Bracero Railroaders. And so yeah, basically we have here Mexican workers during the Bracero Program being recruited to work in agriculture and railroads, which are the two areas that they were recruited to work in. So Gamboa is the last name, if you're curious to write about this topic in your research papers. And yeah, the Bracero Program, I'll talk more about that in next class, but it was an agreement between the United States and Mexico to recruit Mexican workers to come to the United States starting in 1942, after we entered World War II, because we had a labor shortage, specifically in agriculture and railroads. And even though this was designed or initiated to be something only during World War II, in the area of agriculture, the agriculture industry lobbied Congress to renew this program year after year way beyond the end of World War II, all the way until 1964.